Hey creatives! I love helping you to get the most out of your arty stash. So today I thought we could explore inks, and I've got 10 great techniques for you to try. So if you have inks in your stash or you're looking to buy them, then hopefully this will give you some ideas to inspire you to get creative with them. Now the inks that I'm going to use today are acrylic inks, but a lot of these techniques will work with other inks that you might have. So drawing inks, dyes, your liquid watercolors, which are very popular at the moment, and even your ink pad re-inkers. So grab what you have and give them a go and see what you can do. So the paper I'm going to use is this Fabriano artist paper pack, and you can buy this in different weights. So the one I've got is the 120 GSM, which I believe is around £32 if you do your paper weights in pounds. So this paper is perfect for printing on, and it will take light washes, and of course it's great for drawing on as well. And I buy it in bulk like this because I get through a lot of it and it works out a lot cheaper. So have a look around and see what you can get. For these types of experiments you don't necessarily need top quality artist paper. You just want something to play around with and make lots of messes with. And as usual, I've listed all the products that I've used in the description below the video. So if you're using acrylic inks or pigment inks, then it's possible that you've got a bit of sediment at the bottom of your bottle if they've been standing for a while, so you're going to need to mix that back in, so give it a good old shake. Or if there's instructions on the bottle, just follow the instructions. So technique number 1, let's use it with a brayer. So there's tons of ways that you can use inks with brayers, and if you're a card maker then you probably know quite a few already. But you may not have thought about using the inks that you get in jars with brayers, like these acrylic inks. So quick simple way, just drip it out onto a non-absorbent surface like a craft mat or a flat palette, pick it up with the brayer and spread it out on your paper. Now doing it this way you get some great texture. But if you want a smoother look, then apply your ink to a piece of foam to make your own ink pad and use traditional ink pad brayering techniques. But if you're using acrylic inks in that way, then you are going to need to make sure you wash that foam afterwards, as the acrylic inks might dry hard. And another fun way of using a brayer is to use one that already has a texture on it. And I love making my own textures using craft foam, and I've hand cut these and just stuck them to my brayer. But you can also use dyes to do this, so if you've seen my 5 ways with background dyes, then you would have seen me doing that. So I'll leave a link to that video in the cards and also in the description below. And then of course there's always the elastic bands, isn't there? You can just add an elastic band to your brayer, and that's just a super simple way of adding some more texture and getting some fun mark making. So once we're on brayers, why don't we try cutouts and masking? So I've just cut out some really simple shapes just using ordinary copier paper. So this is the kind of stuff that you just put in your printer. So I'm just going to use these shapes to mask off some areas. And I don't want the shapes to move as I pass the brayer over them, so I'm just going to use some low tack tape like washi tape, folded into a tube and stuck on the back of my shapes to keep them in place. So let's have a play and see how well this works. Quite a useful little technique. Now what you need to do is just to make sure that you have enough ink on the edges so you can see that definition between where the mask was and where the mask wasn't when you take the mask off. Okay, next up let's play with some ink washes. Now how these work will depend on what type of ink you're using. So if you're using watercolors or dye-based inks, they may act slightly differently to the acrylic inks. For one thing, quite a lot of the acrylic inks will dry permanently. So once they're dry, if you add water over the top, they won't budge. Whereas with a lot of the fluid watercolors and dye-based inks, you may still get interaction with layers over the top, even after they've dried. But there's nothing stopping you with playing around and seeing how they work. Plus another thing about the acrylic inks, once you've put them down, they tend not to blend in the same way that, say, a fluid watercolour will or a dye-based ink will. And if you can see here, you can still see the lines where I put the brush marks. So if you want blended looks, they do take a little bit more work. So once I've dried this off, let's have a look at what happens when I add another colour over the top. So first I'll add some strong colour where I've only used a little bit of water, and then I'll add a more dilute wash using more water. And as you can see, there's been no movement of the colour underneath, so you can happily layer these colours to get interesting looks. And as this rather wet layer dries, you will get the kind of watercolour blooms that you see, that sort of cauliflower look edges to them, which I think always makes a really nice and interesting texture. But I know it's not to everyone's taste. And another thing to look out for is your edge. So the lines that occur where the pigment sits on the edge of where you put the colour. Now you get these in watercolour as well, but if you try and layer over the top of those, you will dissolve and change them. But with acrylic inks, if they've dried, they tend to stay pretty put and pretty sharp, so they can be quite a fun texture to play with as well. And we'll see more of those and how to use them in the next technique, which is drawing. So of course the simplest way of drawing with these types of inks is to use the eyedropper that comes with the bottle, and you can make some really great marks and do some really expressive kind of drawings with this type of technique. If your ink doesn't come with an eyedropper or you don't want to use it, then of course you can use dip pens to do the same sort of thing, and you can use them as dip pens or you can use them as I'm doing here, and that is to spread out the ink and make more marks. And I've got two different types here. I've got one that holds a nib and one that's been carved from a piece of bamboo. And it's just a fun way of trying out different ways of making marks. And don't forget also to use the flat side of your nib as well. So turn your nib holder or your bamboo pen upside down and use that. And it's just a great way of making some broader marks. And if you don't have dip pens, try using a brush handle. And of course, don't forget your palette knife. You can make some very interesting marks with palette knives. But what I really wanted to show you with the palette knife is technique number 5, which I'm calling scraping, and then we're going to do a wash over. So it is exactly how it sounds. I'm just scraping the ink that's still wet across this page, and I'm using my palette knife for that, but you can also use a plastic card or any straight edge that you might have. And if we take a closer look, you can see some of the marks that I was making earlier with the dip pens, the brush and the eyedropper. And that's because some of the pigment in those marks has dried and is permanent. So this is another great use for your acrylic inks over your dye-based or your fluid watercolours. And look what happens if I then put a wash over the top. So this is just ordinary water on a brush, and it's picking up any of the pigment that's still wet and just drawing it across the page. So there's definitely an element of serendipity in this. It's not something you can control perfectly, but it's something that you can play around with and see how long you need to let things dry, how long they need to stay wet to get these kind of effects. And then work on how to use them to great effect in your artwork. Okay, so as we're kind of on eyedroppers, or at least that's where we started, let's stay with eyedroppers for technique number 6, which is drops and splatters. Now I'm sure you've probably played around with these a lot already. If you haven't, try them at different heights to see what kind of splatter effect you can get. And also don't be afraid of bubbles in these. Bubbles can be great fun and a great way to get an interesting effect. And if your ink bottle doesn't already have an eyedropper, you can just get plastic eyedroppers, and they're often available in chemist shops or in art shops. Other things you're going to want to try is flicking. So see how flicking onto the paper works for you. This is a very messy technique, so you might want to make sure that you're wearing an apron and that your surrounding area is covered. And don't forget to also play around with letting those drops just dribble down the page and see how that works for you. Some more things that you can try with this technique is to just use water as well. Nothing to stop you from splattering water over a page and seeing how that works in the wet ink. And whilst we're at it, why not just add another colour? Giving yourself permission to just have play with inks like this is really good fun and a really good way of getting to know them. And I hope that the techniques that I've showed you so far have been helpful to you. We've got a few more techniques to go, but before we do, give me a shout what kind of inks you are using at the moment. I would love to hear. And let me know what your favourite techniques are for using with them. And of course, if you are finding this video useful, then I really would appreciate if you could like it. That would be fantastic. Share it with anyone you think would also like it and find it helpful. And of course, if you're not one of my subscribers, become one of my subscribers as well. It would be great to have you on board. Okay, so who's up for technique number 7? Everyone get your hands up. So technique number 7 is some more mark making, but this time we're going to use the sponges and a bit of stamping. So it is in fact 2 techniques for the price of 1. I've cut up an ordinary piece of kitchen sponge, But if you wanted to, you could also use some foam like the Ranger's Ink Essentials foam. I've put a little bit on a plastic sheet and I'm just picking up a small amount on my sponge. And if you're using it through stencils, like I'm using here, then you really only need the tiniest amount. It's better to start with less and build up than to have too much and have it squidge underneath the stencil. After a few goes, you soon get the hang of it. And you can do all sorts of other mark making with sponges as well, so try all of those out too. So there's lots of different ways that you can use your stamps and do some printing with your inks as well. So you could put the ink into a sponge and sponge it onto the stamp, or printing mark maker. You can do what I'm doing here, and that's just dipping the mark maker into the ink and then dipping it onto the page. You can also use a brush it on, or a brayer it onto the surface and then press that surface onto your paper. So have a go and see which ones you prefer to use. And as we have all this lovely ink still on our plastic piece of paper, it's time for technique number 8 and a bit of matte printing. So I use this technique a lot in all sorts of things, not just with my inks, but also with my paints as well. And here I'm showing you what it looks like neat, but then also what it looks like if you spray water onto the ink as well to get a more watercolour effect. And if you're a galaxy art fan, then this is a really fun technique for making galaxy art. And I've got a tutorial over on the Blitzy blog when I was working with them that uses this technique with fluid watercolours to make some galaxy art, and it's a great fun way to do it, so have a look at that. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Okay, so next up is a really fun printing technique. So in this technique I'm going to use ink to get a rubbing off of a textured surface, and I'm just using some chipboard pieces to make my textured surface. And you can use anything. If you've got embossing folders, you can use that. I've even done it on things like paper clips and scissors, all sorts of things, so give it a go. So it's very similar to the technique where you'd use a pencil or a crayon to make a rubbing over a textured surface, but in this case we're going to use ink. Now it takes a little bit more practice because you want enough ink to make a rubbing but not so much ink that it just drowns out the shape. So you might need to try it a couple of times to get the hang of this. Now this also works with other paints as well, so this will also work with acrylic paint too. So again, it's another one to try and see what you can do with it. And of course, if you're inspired by anything I'm doing here and you try these out, I would love to see how you get on with them and what you do with them next. I always love seeing the creations you make and where it takes you. I mean, that's the best bit of the job, isn't it? So if you do share anything, do tag me in and I'll come over and have a look, and all of my social media tags are below. So give me a shout. And a big thank you to everyone who does that. I love seeing what you make and it's great to connect with you. And I can't wait to see what you do next. Okay, so our last technique today, we're going to need a piece of string. And this is just ordinary string. So let's see what kind of marks we can make with it. So ink and string are a perfect match. So first up, it is really great at straight lines. And the texture is great fun too. But catch this, I love making circles with them. This is really good fun. Hey, who'd think I'd get a bit overexcited by a piece of string? Okay, let's try making some rounded shapes. And to do this, I think I'll sandwich them between two pieces of paper. Okay, let's try that again, and this time put a little bit more ink on there and see what effect that has. So you've got a couple of really good examples of how to utilise string with your ink. But another thing you can do with string, which is brilliant, is to load it up with ink and then strum it over your surface. So what I mean by this, if you hold one end fixed and stretch the string tight over your piece of paper and flick it like you would a guitar string, so the vibrations cause a great mark on the page. And if you lift the string up and down, you can also get interesting splatter marks as well, which is great fun. And if you want a closer look at these splatter marks, I've got a picture of them on my blog, so I'll leave a link below the video, or if you're watching this on my blog, just scroll down. So I hope your head is buzzing with lots of creative ideas and things you want to try out today. Have fun, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Thanks for watching. Bye!